Hello, YouTube. Welcome to the Compound Fracture YouTube channel. 2 hours before the recording of this video, CBC News published this article on their website. Ottawa tables legislation to send striking Port of Montreal workers back to the job. Now, the Port of Montreal workers have been without a contract since 2018, a very long time to be without a contract. Finally, they reached the point that they had to strike in order to force the Port Authority to bargain with them in good faith. But Ottawa, only 1.5 days into the strike, has decided to end the strike. Now, in response, Mark Ranger, who is the Quebec director of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, released this statement: "Fundamental rights are being violated. It is shameful for a government that calls itself a defender of the middle class." Now, the Conservative Party has announced that they will support the bill. So between Liberal votes and Conservative votes, there's very little chance that this bill fails to quickly pass through Parliament. It'll likely become law very, very soon, effectively denying the right of the Port of Montreal workers to strike. Last night on our Twitch live stream, we had an excellent interview with Mike Palecek about this very issue. Mike is the former national president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and he was national president during the most recent postal workers job action a couple of years ago. So he is an expert on the role of trade unions in the public service in Canada and the history of the Trudeau government and how they have reacted to these types of strike actions. I thought the conversation was excellent. So without further ado, here it is. So, everyone in chat, this is my dear friend Mike, and he is, I already kind of covered a little bit of the ground, but he's someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for the last 16 years. We're very old friends, and here, I'm just going to go to this article. So we have a backdrop. He's a longtime labor activist in this country who has a lot of experience doing many important things and leading and participating in many important struggles. He's a former national president of the Canadian Postal Workers Union, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the youngest union president in our country's history, which is quite a thing, I think, anyway. But maybe that's just me being proud of my friends, so there's that. So he has graciously agreed to come on here and talk about this. The federal government seeming like they are going to legislate the Montreal Dockworkers back to work before the strike even begins. And the dock workers have been without a contract since 2018, right? Like, I think it's 2018. And so that begs the question, do we have a right to bargain in this country? Is that a right that we have?
Are you asking me off the top? Well, I'd say it's a right we have in theory, but anytime we go to exercise that right, the government steps in and removes it and legislates workers back to work. So in Canada, you have the right to strike as long as your strike is not effective, as long as it doesn't inconvenience anyone or cost anybody money or inconvenience the government in any way. So you tell me if that means we have the right to strike, because I look around the world at tin pot dictatorships all over the place that recognize labor rights better than the Canadian government does.
Yeah, well, something about rights, I've always, at least they told me in school back when they were telling me about Canada and our national heritage and the wonderful reasons that we live in such a wonderful country. They talk about rights as being something that's inalienable, right? Something that the government cannot take away because they are rights, and that really doesn't sound like it. So Twisted, one of our lovely audience members, is asking, basically, you can't strike. I think that's what the federal government saying to the dock workers. Is that right? Has this happened in other cases in this country? Is this normal or a new thing?
Oh, it happens repeatedly, and the Liberals have been bad for it. For example, only a couple of years ago, my union went on strike over major issues, health and safety issues around pay equity and other things, and we ended up being legislated back to work before we were even in a full strike. We were just rotating strikes in different cities, one day at a time, and even that mild inconvenience was too much for the Trudeau government to handle. Now, obviously, I'm not the president of CUPW anymore. I don't speak for the union, but I speak as a rank and file postal worker. And certainly the right to strike doesn't mean anything if it doesn't apply to strikes that are inconvenient or strikes that cost too much money or damage the economy. That's the whole point. This is when we're talking about collective bargaining, when we're talking about negotiations for contracts between workers and employers, the bosses hold all the cards. They own everything. They write the paychecks. They dictate the terms. The only power workers have is to stand together with their hands in their pockets and say, we're not going to work until we get a wage that we're happy with. Now, if you can't even handle that, I don't know how this prime minister goes around saying that he's pro-labor or friendly to labor. Let's be clear, Prime Minister Trudeau is one of the worst strike breakers in the history of this country. And any trade unionist that's supporting him at this point should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, it seems to me like here in Canada, we have seen that exact line that you talk about, that when a strike is very inconvenient, they've talked about how this is going to cost tens of millions of dollars a day, this particular one, that it's not allowed to happen. But so I wonder what the difference is between that situation, which we see here, and for instance, in Europe, where all the time you see highways shut down and you see society grind to a halt over lots of issues, not just the lack of a contract, but it could be as simple as the cops doing something wrong, or the government, like what they did to Macron in France. They nearly toppled him, or did they topple him? I'm misremembering. But it seems like it happens an awful lot in Europe, that society is shut down, but it doesn't happen here. Why is that?
Well, and not just in Europe, but all over the world, frankly. Canada seems to stand out. I would go out on a limb and say amongst the G7 economies, Canada has the worst labor record around the right to strike of any industrialized country in the world, frankly. Anywhere else, the idea of simply taking away workers' right to strike whenever they try to use it would be laughed at, would be met with riots in the streets. Here we have a government that claims to be pro-labor, but in fact doesn't recognize the most basic of labor rights, doesn't recognize rights that have been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. It's recognized the right to free collective bargaining is part of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's been upheld in court multiple times. But typically what happens here is they legislate workers back to work. Then there are court challenges, and years later, that legislation gets struck down. After all of the damage is done and everybody's been put through all of the hardships, they strike down the legislation, and then the courts say, bad government, don't do it again. And that's the end of it. And so, of course, they do it again. And so what's really needed at this point is for a major union to say, no, we're not going to accept your back to work legislation. We're going to keep standing here with our hands in our pockets. And I don't know what the workers are going to do in Montreal. I haven't been in touch with people there. But this isn't something that can be allowed to stand. If if the trade union movement means anything in this country, we have to get a handle on this issue, and we have to be able to force governments to back down. And it's happened before in the past. It's happened even with my union. My union has gone on strike in the past when it's been illegal and defied that and fought back and pushed back and made major changes in this country. That's the sort of thing that needs to happen if this government is going to get the message. And you've talked about earlier the sort of historic compromise, and I know you mentioned earlier you wanted me to get into that.
Yes.
Because I made the statement last night that the historic compromise is broken. It's gone. And what that compromise was, this emerged out of the post-war period, when you had in Canada, it was called the RAND formula. It was called slightly different things in other jurisdictions in the States and so on. But the basic idea, and this came out of a strike of auto workers. It was a ruling from Justice Rand, who ruled that workers, have the right to go on strike. But unions have the right to collect dues from their membership, and in fact, the whole membership, the whole workforce will join the union if they vote to do so. And in exchange, they agree not to strike for certain periods of time. They negotiate contracts. This was a compromise because it allowed companies and employers to get some sort of period of stability, because it used to be that workers just walked out whenever they weren't happy with the situation and were willing to stand up and fight, and there was nothing that employers could really count on. And so the labor movement in essence traded that right to strike whenever they wanted, which was actually kind of illegal, but we did it anyways. They traded that right to strike for whenever they wanted in order to get certain things guaranteed, like stability in the workplace, a collective agreement, fair rules that everybody could work under, a grievance procedure to address problems when they come up, all of these things. And the linchpin to the whole thing, the underlining most important thing, was the fact that you could freely bargain that collective agreement. That workers, once every 4 years or however long they agree to, can say, we're not going to work again until we have the next few years figured out, until we have a contract we can live with. And so that was the historic compromise. That was the RAND formula, and it's been the basis of modern labor relations in Canada ever since. So that compromise has been thrown out the window. They no longer recognize the right to strike. Now they say that if you go on strike, they will impose a contract. They'll bring in legislation. They'll appoint somebody to come in and say, no, this is what you work for. So they've completely removed that. And even if you take this example that's happening right now with the Port of Montreal, with those workers, the federal government says they're considering intervening. Well, hang on here. I know a thing or two about collective bargaining. And what I can tell you is that the federal government has already intervened in this dispute, because the moment a government says, we're going to legislate an end to this strike, they take away any incentive for the employer to negotiate. Why on earth would any employer negotiate when the government has just said they're going to come in and do the dirty work? They're going to end the strike for them, and they don't have to worry about these basic democratic rights of their workers. So the Liberals have already intervened in this labor dispute before it even started. Those workers weren't even allowed to walk off the job without the government coming in and saying, we're going to end your strike. What kind of progressive prime minister is this? This prime minister is a strike breaker.
So we have a lot of international viewers and a lot of Americans among our audience who aren't familiar with the particular strikes that have happened in the last few years in Canada. Is this a common thing, or is it something that is this new, or is it is it something that you think perhaps these the bosses at the dock might have expected, might have seen coming? Is this something that is normal?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, the bosses know this is coming, and this has become normalized. It has been normal at different periods in Canadian history. The right to strike has been a century-long struggle in this country that has never been properly achieved. Workers in the United States have more rights to walk off the job than workers in Canada do by miles. It's not even close. Um, so this is a long fought issue for workers here. Uh, at the same time, employers have come to expect it, and whenever there's a major strike, and when I say major, I just mean something important, something that actually affects the economy, or something that people notice. Which, I don't know, it's kind of the point of a strike. But so, as I say, if a strike is effective, it will be declared illegal. It doesn't matter whether you're railroad workers, or working for airlines, or at the ports, or postal workers.
So you mentioned that this is something that's happened in different periods in Canadian history, that there have been these types of legislations in other times. How was this stopped then? How did the workers fight back against these types of policies then?
So there have been lots of lawsuits and things like that against this type of legislation. Lots of them have been successful. Each one advances the collective rights of the workforce in theory. Um, I think those sorts of things are worth doing. But the only time that the governments and employers have really felt the pinch is when workers just refuse to follow that legislation and don't go back. And that's happened many times throughout the history of this country. And at the provincial level, more commonly; at the federal level, very rarely. I know you and I were both involved in the anti-Campbell movement in British Columbia, which saw repeated use of back to work legislation from the government against any public sector workers that tried to strike. And eventually people just stopped following. And the first strike, of course, was the UBC teaching assistants, which is that strike was led by a dear friend of ours,
Yes.
Alex Grant,
Yes.
friend and comrade, and at QP 2278. So this is a small local of teaching assistants, of students, of not just a few thousand members, not even that. But they said, no, we're not going to go back. And they made the government blink after a few days. Before things got too serious, the government offered binding arbitration. And they accepted that, which is, actually what governments are forcing on people now with legislation. But that they used that as a climb down, but they set a precedent, and following that, whenever they tried to legislate public sector workers back to work, they faced the specter of defiance of that legislation and broader mobilization towards general strikes even. I don't have the time to go into the whole history of the movement there, but yeah, there were multiple big strikes. Teachers defied legislation. There was a lot of pushback, and there were solidarity strikes. I can remember a day when CUPE members across the Lower Mainland walked out in solidarity with teachers. So it's that kind of cross-union solidarity of getting broad layers of the working class to stand together and say, no, we're not going to let you do this to us anymore. We have to reach that breaking point where people aren't willing to accept it. And I think we're coming close. I hate to quote JFK, but there's a really good quote from him when he said, "Those who make peaceful revolutions impossible make violent revolutions inevitable." And that would be a lesson that maybe this government should think about. And remember that the Rand formula, this historic compromise, was just that, because the alternative was class war. And if you want to go there, well, I think the working class maybe needs to go there, because they've broken that compromise, frankly. It's time that we take back our our right to strike whenever we want, that we walk off the job whenever we want, that we make those collective decisions and we fight back with everything that comes at us in those situations. That's the only way we're going to turn the tide on this.
Well, it's really hard, very, very hard to argue with the necessity of that, given the situation in this country. For anyone who values the right to strike, or anyone who values the gains that were made and are held onto by the trade union movement, it's hard for me to imagine anyone disagreeing with the need to fight against a government that denies the right to collective bargaining, if it's big enough to matter. Well, to matter for a society as a whole.
Look, we live in a system called capitalism, where all of the major levers of the economy are owned by large corporations, by billionaires that aren't accountable to people. They aren't even accountable to governments. They buy governments. They own governments. The only thing we have in this system to hold those employers and those really masters of the economy, the owners, as George Carlin called them, the only thing we have to hold them account is the right to withdraw our labor. It's the one trump card that workers have against all of the power of the bosses, their governments, the full might of the police, the military, the courts, and everything else. They can send in police to try and enforce this kind of stuff. They can fire people. They can do all kinds of nasty things. But the one thing the bosses cannot do is actually the work. They can't run their business because they don't run their businesses. Workers do. So if you take that away, what do you have left? You have a dictatorship. You have a dictatorship of capital, of the wealthy, that can buy governments that will do their bidding, that can elect the people they want to represent them, and that can make sure that anytime the workers try to push for something better, they're crushed and put back in line. So that's the system that Trudeau is driving us towards. If you ask me, that's worth fighting for. And it's worth fighting against, I should say.
Yes.
It's worth fighting to stop the implementation of this. Because all of the rights the workers have in this country were fought for. None of them were given to us, not just in this country, in any country. People fought for these rights, they bled for these rights, and they died for these rights. In your part of the world, there's a whole handful of labor martyrs that were killed in strikes. Going back, of course, the most famous being the Ginger Goodwin. That was
yes.
It's another story altogether. But
it is.
Others in
it's a very
Vancouver,
good story. We'll tell it sometime on here.
Killed in dockworkers strikes in Vancouver, specifically around fighting for the right to strike. This is something that leaders in this country, workers, leaders have died for. Shame on us if we don't defend it with the same vigor that they did.
So I guess my next question is, it's kind of a two-part question. For people who agree wholeheartedly with you, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything you're saying here, how do we do something? What do we do? One, if we're part of a trade union, if we're part of especially a trade union that faces these types of back-to-work legislation, or an allied trade union. And two, if we're not part of a trade union, if we're not part of the labor movement, is there any way that we can play a role? I'm not part of a trade union, for instance. Is there any way I can play a role?
Okay. So, I mean, if you're a member of a union that may face this sort of situation, then this is something that you need to be involved in, and something that you need to make it clear to to your union leadership, as well as your coworkers and your sisters and brothers, that it's something that you're willing to stand up and fight for. It's something that you're willing to draw a line in the sand around. And um, that's a collective decision that the movement has to make. You know, it's not going to be an easy decision, and it's not going to be easy when it happens. So I think the main thing to do is to pass resolutions of support and so on. I know passing a resolution in and of itself might just seem like paperwork, but if local unions, etc., pass resolutions of support and send that to other unions and send that to their leadership, saying we're ready, you know, they can demonstrate that they're ready to take this on. You know, there's no magic wand to wave that will make this all happen, but there has to be a base level of organizing and connection for union militants. You know, I've been for years trying to find ways to pull together a broad network of radicals within the labor movement. I think that's something that's urgently needed in this kind of stuff. For people outside of the movement, or people rather that aren't union members, I think there's a lot you can do to support. Certainly, getting in touch with unions in any kind of struggle. Picket line support is always welcome. If there's a strike anywhere in your town, honestly, go buy some Timbits and head to the picket line and just tell those workers you support them. It'll mean the world to them. They might be sick of Timbits by then, so get there quick. You can put the pressure onto politicians, letting members of parliament know that you won't vote for people if they don't support basic labor rights. And you can join an organization that is going to actually participate in these struggles. And you'll find lots of progressive organizations or socialist organizations across the country that are, involved in a variety of different campaigns, and they often come together around labor struggles. So there are, many different ways to get involved.
Well, that sounds excellent. Yeah. I suppose the number of ways to get involved is kind of limitless. It's a society-wide struggle. Certainly, if we're talking about the struggle against capitalism, it's a society-wide struggle. But also, it seems to me like we've seen the trade union struggle as being a smaller and smaller part of society that's involved in this with time. And we even see it within people will even say it's only some trade unions. For instance, these types of back-to-work legislations seem to have targeted specifically public sector unions, for the most part. I'm not sure if the dock in Montreal is privately run. I know some of the Vancouver ones are, but either way, like unions that do large-scale public service work. And so I wonder if there's ways to broaden this the necessity for fight back to begin to draw people together, where it seems to me anyway like the government has tried to pull us apart.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, this doesn't just apply to public sector workers. I think we see it often with public sector workers because it's an easy out for the government. In that situation, they hold all the cards, both as the employer and as the people that write the legislation. And so, it's fairly obvious the conflict there. But also, whenever we see an impactful strike in the private sector, we've seen back to work legislation, whether it's with the CP rail workers, Teamsters Rail, or the airline industry. We've seen governments legislate private sector workers back to work as well. But I think we need to be careful not to fall into a false dichotomy around this. This affects all workers, whether you're public sector or private sector. Governments will legislate you back to work if they think your strike is effective. And so that's something that we really need to stand together on, not let them drive this sort of wedge between, as if there's a difference between public sector workers and private sector workers. You know, we all work for a living. We sell our labor, our labor power. That's how we make our living. Doesn't really matter whether it's to the private sector or the public sector in terms of the class struggle. We're all on the same side. But that's what we need. We need to see solidarity between private and public sector workers. And if you look back, I know I talked about the anti-Campbell movement earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That was when you really saw the government start to freak out, is when they saw strike action, wildcat sympathy strikes happening in the private sector, when lumber mills started shutting down in solidarity with the hospital employees union. I can imagine alarm bells were ringing in Victoria. So we have power when we stand together.
Sounds like you're talking about a general strike. That's something that almost happened. I certainly remember during those anti-Campbell days and the BCTF strike, there were rolling general strikes. Different parts of the province were shut down one after another. And it seemed like the government gave up the fight and backed down pretty quickly once it became clear that that was leading to a generalized general strike, a full province-wide one. What do you think has stopped that type of push since then? At least I haven't seen very much of it in the years since then, because that was, 15 years ago now? Something like that? Maybe a bit longer.
Yeah. Well, I take kind of a long view of these things. And these sort of mass struggles where the whole of the working class gets involved in fighting back, they tend to happen, every generation or so. You have this wave that lasts several years of escalating movements and so on. So we have to look at these things in their historical context. Well, another important feature that you'll find in them is that it's often sparked off by the mass movements are sparked off by unexpected things. And it could be the smallest spark that suddenly ignites a powder keg when conditions have built up such that it is a powder keg. So I think the when it comes to what's going to make this change, it's a matter of organization amongst the working class, and it's a matter of building the confidence for workers to act at the rank and file level. And I often these things are driven from the work floors, driven from the rank and file level. And we saw that certainly through the anti-Campbell movement. I won't get into specifics on it, but when there were various strikes where the workers ran out far ahead of the leaders, and in doing so, they forced the leaders to catch up with them. So there's a contradictory process at work here between the leadership and membership of any mass organization or mass union, and we have to wrap our heads around that process. That being said, if you look around this country right now, working people are facing tremendous difficulties,
Yes.
compounded by the pandemic, of course. We have an absolute economic crisis. We have a housing crisis. We have problem after problem piling up. Sure looks like a powder keg to me. And Mr. Trudeau's running around playing with a lighter. So whether or not that's a good idea, we'll leave that to him. but one of these days it's going to blow up in his face.
Sure sounds like it. And frankly, from my perspective, I hope it's sooner rather than later. Generally, earth-shattering kabooms are not something that you cheer for. But in this case, it seems to me like what has happened in these past few years has taken away one of our most important and fundamental rights as Canadians, and frankly, not even as Canadians, but as people in a economy that is based upon the principles of fair collective bargaining, that has pulled itself out from the era prior to unions developing strength, where the bosses could get away with whatever they wanted, whatever wages they wanted, and whatever working conditions they wanted. It strikes me that this had better happen sooner rather than later. And I certainly hope that people are willing to fight and put everything that they can into that fight. Now, one thing I wonder is, it seems like people are desperate, as you mentioned, and it is a powder keg, as you mentioned. What do you think would push this over? What do you think would burst it? Do you think that this struggle has the potential to burst it? It's a difficult question.
Well, I think any struggle has the potential. You know, going back to the example in BC, nobody would have imagined that teaching assistants would be the ones to kick it off and say, we're not going to do it anymore. And they set a precedent for the movement when they did that. There was a consciousness shift. So, as I said, I'm not in touch with the union in Montreal with those workers, or I don't know where they're at. But I think it only takes a spark. So, does this have the potential? Absolutely. If things came together that way, if people were willing to take a stand, I think you would see masses rallying behind them. But this is a difficult time for not just for workers, for unions. I understand that a lot of the labor movement right now have been working working every waking hour for the last year and a half trying to deal with this pandemic. So there's a certain exhaustion among layers as well, and people who are facing really terrible circumstances usually do one of two things: they either put their heads down, or there's an explosion of struggle.
Yes.
And there's not really an in between. So I don't know if everything's there, if all of the conditions are there, if the organization is there to spark this. But I suppose you never do at the outset. And as I've said, these things often tend to happen by surprise.
Yes, they sure do. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have that spring to mind. Do you have anything else you'd like to talk about? Anything else you'd like to share? Maybe something you'd like to plug? Maybe a podcast? I love this man's podcast, by the way. It's a great podcast, and everyone should check it out.
I haven't been keeping up with it lately. I'm not sure when I'll get back to it, but I think this is an interesting time in the history of the world. Frankly, we have an unprecedented crisis in terms of climate change, which is an existential threat to humanity. Now we have this global pandemic, which is killing millions of people and disrupting billions of lives. You know, the way the entire economies have been forced to shift and adapt to this thing, and often it's workers that are paying the price for in that change. So this is a time that is a transitional period in history. Things cannot continue like this for much longer. There will be a breaking point. There will be a change. And what happens over the next year or two could really be defining for the next decade or more, in terms of whether or not working class people are going to get anything approaching better lives. As long as I've been in the workforce, things have just been getting worse. I think that's a general feeling. This can't continue indefinitely.
No.
I guess the only constant is change, and change is going to come.
Oh, yes, it is. Don't know if that's where you were going with that, but that's where my mind went. Anyway, thank you so much, Mike, for coming on my fledgling,
Anytime.
my fledgling little channel. We will definitely invite you back when there's news and happenings afoot, because we like talking about happenings when they are afoot. So I love hearing from you, and I love your very, very well-informed perspectives about revolutionary struggle, as well as the trade union movement and the history of trade union struggle. And I'm sure there will be many, many, many times in the future where that insight would be welcome on this channel. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, Mike.
Have a good night.
All right. Well, that was a conversation that I thought was very, very nice, and about a very difficult subject. Difficult for our country. Now, obviously, I didn't have the most professional looking setup here, but hopefully, at some point in the future, I'm glad you liked it twisted. Hopefully, at some point in the future, I'll have a more professional looking layout for such conversations. I know Mike advertised or publicized that he was going to be on this channel just as he came on. So I'm sure we have a few new viewers, but for my viewers who stuck around, I'm not sure how many people did. Finboy and Twisted, that's awesome. I want to do more of that. I want to do more of in-depth topics about revolution, about the state of the world, about international affairs and geopolitics in all of its many beautiful forms, as well as the internet left, as well as what we're doing within these mediums, as Twitch viewers, as YouTube viewers, as Twitter users. So I've had this conversation an awful lot of times with old school activists, with activists who have not spent much time on the internet and are used to organizing in person. I've always described the internet as being like the world's biggest pub. And when you have things happening within your society, like if you're part of a strike movement, if you're part of any sort of movement, any sort of socialist organization, anything, the best conversations happen in the pub. You know, everyone knows that. You go to the pub after whatever it is, and you talk about what's next. You talk about what's important. And I think that's the role the internet plays. I think all too often people make the mistake of saying, if you're an internet activist, you're not a real activist. But I think internet conversations are every bit as much a part of real activism as pub conversations are. It's not a substitute for doing the work. It's never a substitute for doing the work, but the conversations are absolutely essential. Few insights as someone from Quebec, Finboy. You should check out the VOD. I'll post it later. What we were actually talking about was your province. It was the, here we go, screen cap. The federal government set to intervene as the Port of Montreal heads towards another strike. So Premier Legault has welcomed federal intervention with open arms to break the strike of the Montreal Dockworkers, which began this morning. As far as I know, and actually it's a good idea to look into this. I'm pulling up Google News here, see if there's anything new. Dock strike. because I was kind of expecting Trudeau to come down and legislate them back today, like right away. It seemed like the noise that was being made was that they'd do it before the strike even began. But it doesn't look like that's happened, so that's good. Kamloops this week. You can tell I'm in BC because I'm getting Kamloops newspapers about Montreal stories. But yeah. Anyway, so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. They've held off at least for now. No, unions absolutely have not had it easy of late at all. And Mike's point was very well made, I thought, one of the last ones in that conversation about how when things are hard, which they most certainly are right now, it can go either of two directions. People are afraid. People are afraid because the economy, we don't know what the economy is going to look like next year. We don't know how long COVID will linger. We don't know how long its effects will linger in the economy. And people are gripping tightly a hold of what they have right now. They're afraid to lose what security remains, because we've all had so much of a sense of security taken away from us in the last year. And I think that can go both ways. If and I believe this is very true, I believe that this has been an accelerating process over the last few years, that more and more these back to work legislations happen immediately, like snap your fingers, the strike's done. At least that's the goal. Sometimes a union will hold out for a little while. They will resist the back to work legislation, may even do some fancy wildcatting and stuff, though there's less of that these days too. But ultimately, the government will use the legislation to fine the unions and fine the workers and find any way that they can to make it impossible to continue the strike. I remember the last BC teachers strike, which was a few years, it wasn't that long ago, 5 years ago maybe. That's just a guess off the top of my head, something like that though. They, the BCTF did defy back to work legislation, and the union was fined just a tremendous amount of money from the government for ostensibly breaking the laws. Now the Supreme Court of Canada and the Superior Court of BC both repeatedly have come down on the side of striking workers in these cases. But until it has a chance to go all the way through the court system, the government has the authority to say what you're doing is illegal and we're going to fine you for that. And then it's been a question of having strike pay, right? The strike pay that's set aside for a long fight, suddenly that strike pay is going to pay the fines. And it'll bleed a union dry until it becomes very difficult to maintain the struggle. And it puts a lot of pressure on the workers to give in, especially when the government is telling them what you're doing is illegal. You're going back one way or the other. And the bosses are telling them, this is already decided. It's already over. Just give in. Give up. And I think Mike was absolutely right that it will take a stronger fight, not just to bring it back to where it used to be, but to prevent it getting a whole lot worse. Because right now, at least as far as I see it, there's a snowball running straight downhill. It's running straight downhill towards the end of the right to bargain in this country. And I am anxious to see fight back in all provinces. Certainly Quebec has always been the fightingest of the Canadian provinces. It's always been the highest level of unionization among the large population provinces anyway.